Hi everyone, this is Dr. Marks, and today we're going to be talking about information literacy related to the fields of both economics and biology. Now, economics and biology are fields that both rely heavily on information, and one key type of information that we use a lot of is data. Now, economists might use data on things like economic indicators, but biologists use data related to species diversity and abundance. So while I might be looking at GDP figures for Ecuador and inflation and unemployment rates, Dr. Hank might be thinking about how diverse is the Amazon jungle and measuring things related to abundance of species. But both are data related, right? So both of our disciplines are involved in collecting data, and you'll be involved as well. Now, the field work that you're going to be conducting in the Amazon is also a form of data collection. So all of us are going to be doing a lot having to do with data for this particular class. Now, why do we use data in these fields? Both economists and scientists rely on data for illustration. And it might be that we're looking at just a single statistic. Maybe I'm looking at GDP for a nation like Ecuador in 2018, and I want to get a sense of what does Ecuador look like given the most recent full year of data that I can get. We might be looking at the population of the pink river dolphin in year 2017. And again, that's a single statistic that might help tell us something. But of course, we also use a lot of things related to charts or graphs because we can get more information communicated that way. If we look at a chart or a graph, it might allow us to look at a trend. So maybe I want to graph inflation for Ecuador over time. Maybe that graph of inflation is going to be very meaningful to tell me, wow, inflation's really gone up in Ecuador. And that might lead to certain problems that we want to talk about. Or Dr. Hank might be looking at the number of tree species in a virgin forest and comparing that to restored forests and making that kind of comparison. So again, we can communicate a lot of information when we do it in a chart or a graph, but again, it's data. Now, data helps to educate and inform us, and you're going to learn a lot of new information in this class, a lot of which will be data, right? So a lot of what we're going to do is tied to data that's going to inform you about things like Ecuador's economy. So of course, informing you about Ecuador's economy will fall to me. But you're also going to have data related to the biodiversity in the Amazon. Of course, that will fall to Dr. Hank. We use data to motivate or justify a point of view. So if we wanted to say that the environment is deteriorating, maybe we're talking about in Ecuador, the Amazon specifically, well, we need data to be able to prove that, to motivate it. If I want to say that Ecuador's economy is stressed, again, I need some way of illustrating what I mean by an economy that's stressed. I need to be able to prove it. And so I need data for that as well. When we use data, it moves us out of what we call the normative. Normative statements are our opinions. And of course, our opinions can't be tested, and the scientific method can't be applied to answer questions when they're purely just our opinions, when it's normative. For example, I might say Ecuador should be more concerned about the environment in the Amazon. Well, probably a lot of us agree with that statement, but can I subject that statement to the scientific method? Well, no. In fact, it would be hard for me to even defend that because I haven't said anything really substantial. I haven't backed it with any kind of data. I've just made this statement. I might say Ecuador's priorities are misplaced. And again, you might agree with me, but just evaluating that statement alone without any data provided to put it in a context, those are purely normative, and there's really not a lot that I can do with that in terms of rigorously subjecting it to some kind of investigation, right? If I say revenues from oil is more important than the health of the Amazon. So again, clearly that's an opinion, and I can't test this either. So you understand what I'm trying to say. When we're giving normative statements, there are opinions. We can't test them. We can't apply the scientific method. Generally, we want to be speaking in the positive. When we're talking in the positive, we're talking about conclusions that come from theory, models, or data. And so when we make conclusions from theories, models, or data, then these are things that are testable. because they don't reflect just our opinions. They're going to be something that we can substantiate. Now, you could have an assignment that specifies you to give your opinion. So I want to be very clear. When I say we want to be speaking in the positive, there are certainly exceptions to that. If your professor asks you to write a paper about your opinion about the Endangered Species Act, then you're being asked to be normative. You're being asked about your opinion. But, and there's a big but, you might choose to back up your opinion with positive elements, right? I'm thinking if you were writing a paper on the Endangered Species Act and you said, that you're in favor of it or that you think it does a good job, that's normative. But you could use positive elements, things like data, to back up what you're saying. Maybe it's saved a lot of species, or maybe you can talk about how it's protected habitat successfully. There's a lot of positive things you can use to back up a normative position, right? So we might be asking you to be normative at times, but back it up with something positive. And again, backing things up with data would be a good idea. So in this example, we would hope that you would get into something like estimation of costs. Maybe you'd say, hey, look, I'm against the Endangered Species Act, or maybe I want to say I don't think it does a good job protecting species, and maybe I want to say, look, we haven't seen a lot of species recover, or maybe I want to focus on the costs of implementing the Endangered Species Act and the success that that money and that investment has led to. Again, these are normative positions that are defended with positive elements. You get the idea. So consider the following statement. Longwood University is not doing a good job attracting students. Longwood University is not doing a good job attracting students. So everyone agree this sounds like an opinion. We can't really test it. So it's clearly normative. But now look at this statement. Data shows that Longwood's enrollment has fallen by 6% in the last year. Well, do you agree that I'm kind of getting the same sentiment across? But instead of saying, hey, Longwood's not doing a good job, data shows that enrollment has fallen. Well, this statement now is testable. Similar sentiment, but now I've written something that's testable, and we can use it to defend our position. So this is clearly positive. So I want to point out that you can say things normatively or you can say things positively. And again, there are certain contexts for both. Sometimes we might ask you to give us a very normative position. But in a research paper, probably you're not being asked to be normative. In a research paper, you're probably being asked to be positive. So I have to remind myself sometimes as I write papers to remain in the positive and not let my normative ideas come into play if it's not the right context or if it's not the right audience for it. Now let's talk about how this connects to assignments for this particular class. There are going to be times in this class that we ask you for your opinion. And when we ask you for your opinion, we are going to be asking you to be normative. But as we just said in the previous slide, we probably want you to use positive information to back up your points. So if I give you an assignment and you are asked for your opinion on something that you're seeing in the Amazon jungle or a policy that has been passed, well, there are things that you can pull from. First of all, you've got your field notebook, right? And so your field notebook is going to help you because you're going to be recording your observations. You can also think about other observations that you've made that maybe don't tie in specifically to your field notebook, but might be about standard of living or things related to the economy, daily life for people in Ecuador, or daily life for indigenous people in the Amazon. And of course, your experiences. Being there, keep your eyes open and really take it all in because you can pull this information into your assignments. Of course, it's important that you also retain what's been learned from professors, from your local guides, and from your hosts. So bottom line is you might be asked to give some normative discussions backed by positive information. So at this point, you need to know what we mean by that. So let's talk about sources of data. Primary sources are going to be key here, especially in science, right? Because they provide first-hand information. So primary sources is going to be the data that's generated when we do experiments, when we give surveys and collect data that way, or we do any other kind of first-hand data collection technique. So this is first-hand information. Lots of peer-reviewed journal articles published involve scientific studies, and those are primary sources. So Dr. Hank, when he works with crawfish or crayfish or whatever those little boogers are called, when he's in his lab at Longwood University, he's generating primary data, and then of course he's going to publish it. I've generated primary data through surveys in some of the recent work I've done. So both of us deal with primary data, and we publish that primary data and our studies related to primary data in peer-reviewed journals. There's also large databases. Large databases are also an important source of primary data. For example, the U.S. Department of Census. You know that your family might have received something to fill out for the Census Bureau, and they're collecting first-hand information, trying to establish what population looks like and other things related to the United States. So that would be a very large data set, and I can get on that data set and I could search through that data set and collect information from a primary source. Now let's talk about secondary sources of data. And these are going to be where they use data from other sources to do an analysis. So secondary sources, we're using data from somebody else's work to do an analysis. So let's say that people are reading a study by Smith in 2018, but Smith 2018 used data from the Census Bureau. Now the Census Bureau is a primary source, right? But when Smith uses it, he's using it secondhand. So this becomes a little bit different. This would be making Smith a secondary source of information. Or maybe Smith uses data published by an environmental organization, and he wants to do further analysis with that. Again, environmental organizations publish primary data too. When Smith uses it, it becomes a secondary source. I collected data about high schools in Virginia that was available from the Department of Education. That was primary data from the Department of Education, but when I use it in my study, I become a secondary source. And when I used that data, I created economic and statistical models, and I published that stuff. But the primary information came from the Department of Economics. Finally, we have, after primary and secondary sources, we have tertiary sources. And that's going to be where you find summaries of others' work. And you're very familiar with tertiary sources because as students, you guys always end up on Wikipedia, or maybe you've seen an encyclopedia. When I was growing up, we had to do lots of research out of encyclopedias. Now you've got all kinds of other things that you can get at the click of a mouse on the internet. But guys, these are not primary sources, right? And they're not good replacements for primary or secondary sources. So when your professors say Wikipedia is not an acceptable source, it's because it's a tertiary source. So in summary, the primary source is the original data collected by the researchers. Dr. Henk in his lab studying crawfish, or me giving a survey to students and creating a data set. The secondary source is the study that uses the data collected by others. So this is when I'm doing economic modeling using data from the Department of Education website. And finally, tertiary sources is the summary of primary and secondary sources, and so that's where we see Wikipedia. Remember, primary data sources are where we want to go, if at all possible, but these secondary sources also make big contributions. So I hope that I've made a good contribution when I do this big statistical analysis of school systems and standardized test scores using Department of Education data. So just because I didn't generate the data myself doesn't mean it's not a good contribution, because I certainly made a contribution in terms of my findings. But again, it wasn't my data. We can read the analysis performed with primary data, and that's really, really important. And so if you're reading a study and it's somebody's report and they generated the primary data, that's great. If you're reading somebody's report and they did the analysis from somebody else's primary data, there's still a lot to learn. But bottom line, we want to avoid these tertiary sources like Wikipedia because there are so many better places to go. Let me just show you an example. This is a Wikipedia entry related to gross domestic product per capita across nations. So this is the kind of thing my students in econ would be using a lot, but it summarizes 3 key sources of data. It's not a good source to use because, again, all it's doing is summarizing stuff that I could find elsewhere. We need to go to the primary source. So you see here, they report data from the International Monetary Fund, that's a primary source, and the World Bank, a primary source, and the Central Intelligence Agency, a primary source of data. So going to Wikipedia isn't really a good idea. I should go to the IMF and the World Bank and the Central Intelligence Agency. So let's talk about getting information. As we said, scientists typically collect their own data. That's one thing that you're trained to do if some of you are biology or other science majors. Economists and, of course, other social scientists often collect their own data as well. For example, my whole PhD dissertation was related to data that I generated in a laboratory, an economics laboratory. And so some of us do that kind of work as well. So whether we're talking about scientists or economists or other social scientists, they do design experiments and then they execute these experiments and they collect their own primary data. Some research might also use surveys to collect primary data too. But for those of you that have been trained in science, most of your data is coming from experiments, right? Now, sometimes we use these larger databases that I've already mentioned, and so these might be ones that are maintained by state or government agencies. There's so much data available, and it's really good, rich data, and it's maintained by either state governments or it could be federal government agencies. And of course, there's also great data that comes from nonprofit organizations. But bottom line is that for our disciplines, primary sources for information are going to be peer-reviewed journals. That's really kind of one of the key places we go for information, peer-reviewed journal articles, and databases like what we're describing. So I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about kind of these big data sets and peer-reviewed journals. So here are some examples of the kinds of things that we find out there that are publicly available. And I'm just giving you a few that Dr. Henk has provided me. The EPA has a National Lakes Assessment, which gives us data on all the lake conditions in the United States. And then the IUCN Red List gives us all kinds of data on endangered species. Crocbite is a place you can go if you want to get data on global crocodile attacks. That's a little disturbing. eBirds gives you data on global bird species distribution and abundance measures. And then I added my own ECON example, Poverty Inequality Data Portal from the World Bank gives us data on all kinds of issues related to poverty by country. Guys, this list could go on and on and on and on. There's so many great places to get data, and these are primary data sources, and that's what's important to understand, that these large governmental data sources, or these ones that are maintained by nonprofit organizations, are generally primary data. Now, peer-reviewed journals, as we've talked about, is also a very important source for researchers. This is where researchers publish their original work, and this information is critically reviewed by the experts in the field. So here's how it works. I have a paper and I get it, as solid and strong as I possibly can, and I submit it for publication into a peer-reviewed journal in economics. But then they're going to send it out to 2 or 3 economists in my field, my specific field of study, and they're really going to read it critically. They might say, this is a great paper. They might say, this is a horrible paper. Or they might say, I kind of like the direction they're going in, but it needs some more work. And they might suggest a lot of other things that I need to do the paper. But because these are peer-reviewed, we know that they've gone through a critical process of being evaluated, and that's what makes them so good. So these kinds of journals are a key source of information for all researchers, not just in science fields, but in my discipline as well. Every discipline has peer-reviewed journals that they rely on. And the great thing is that you can access a lot of these articles through academic search engines. Now, you might not be able to get to everything, but you can get to a lot of stuff. Where would you go if you were trying to get to peer-reviewed journal articles? Well, you can go to Google Scholar. You can go to ResearchGate, which is a relatively new thing, and ResearchGate allows the professors who publish the work to put their work on their page, and so I can find other people's work there, or I can click a button and say, could you make this available to me or send this to me? Web of Science, which you can get through the library, or something similar for my field, EconLit. It's basically a database that can be searched, and we can link to that through the library. There are many, many search engines that are offered through the library that allow you to access these compilations of sources that we have access to because we're a state agency. So definitely take advantage of those. Now, most of us don't even look at journals in paper anymore, but you've probably seen these kinds of journals maybe hanging in your academic building, or maybe there's some kind of trophy case where they're displaying. As you can see, there's econ ones on the left, and on the right are some science ones. The science people certainly know how to make theirs look a lot more interesting than we do. Ours are a little lame looking, is that true? But nevertheless, you can access a lot of stuff electronically. Now, let's talk about where to go to get specific information. Let's start with econ data. Let's say that I give you an assignment and you have to find econ information. Well, the CIA World Factbook is a great place for country-specific data. And the beautiful thing about this is that you can look up data by country. So if you're only interested in Thailand, you can look at Thailand, or only in Guatemala, you can look at Guatemala. And you can get an overview of more than just the economy, although there's a lot of great information about the economy. They have stuff on the environment, on education levels, on type of government. And so I've pulled an example. So this is Ecuador. And so if you go to the page for Ecuador, you're going to see that it's going to give you an introduction. It's going to cover geography. It's going to cover people and society, government, the economy, energy, communications, transportation, military, and security. So it's not purely, all just economics, but it gives you some stuff that definitely overlaps other disciplines as well. So this is the World Factbook. Really good stuff. Now, agencies and some of our big banks, our central banks, also collect a lot of great data, and it's publicly available. They all have these large staff of economists, and so that's how they're able to compile these huge data sets and do lots of research as well. So one really good source is the World Bank. We've got the International Monetary Fund. You've got the Federal Reserve Bank, our central bank of the United States. And then lots of government agencies that focus probably more on domestic stuff. You've got the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics. You've got the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency that does cover stuff that overlaps in my discipline. I do have some background in environmental economics, and so some of the information that I want would be there as well. I know scientists would also be interested in that. We've got the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis and the Economic Report of the President. And again, we could go on and on and on, but these are really good sources that offer primary data, and these are really well-known, valid sources. Now let's talk about where to get good science data. And so Dr. Hank has provided this information for me. And of course, in our country, one of the best sources is the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. The EPA conducts national studies to collect baseline environmental data. There is so much stuff available from them. For example, they're the ones that do the National Lakes Assessment Database. So if somebody wanted to get a sense of water quality in lakes and track it over time, they could access this database. And so how amazing is it that people at the EPA are in charge of putting together this huge statistical survey about lakes and ponds and reservoirs? Very valuable information for a lot of people in that field. And it's available to anyone, and that's the beauty of it. So Dr. Hank has provided me with just kind of a page so you can get a sense of what this particular study might look like. And this is just one example that he's offering you. But very, very rich data. And you can probably see on the right that you can transform some of this data. A lot of these types of websites give you these interactive data tools where you can say, these are the countries I want, or these are the geographical locations I want, or these are the years that I want, and you can tailor it yourself. Of course, nonprofit agencies collect a lot of good environmental data. We've got the Worldwide Fund for Nature, Sierra Club, Greenpeace, Natural Resource Defense Council, the World Wildlife Fund. Again, these are going to have kind of specific interests and agendas tied to them clearly, but a lot of these organizations are also good sources of data. Now, let's move on to talk about bias in data. It's important that we evaluate the data or information that we're using because we don't want bias. So we've got to consider the source. We want to avoid bias in our own data as well. So we don't want to use somebody else's data if it's biased. And when we generate our own data, we don't want our own data to have bias. In other words, we want data to be representative, and we don't want to design our data collection process to support our hypothesis, right? That would be really bad use of the scientific method. So I don't want to kind of manipulate how I collect data because I want it to support the hypothesis or my own particular agenda. So we need to ask if our data paints a fair or an unfair picture, one that is accurate. Selection bias is a really big issue. Data is selected from a subjective perspective, and that's going to generate this biased outcome. So here's an example. Maybe I use a sample of data that does not reflect the population as a whole. So if I wanted to make my data skew in a direction that supports my position, then I might introduce intentionally selection bias by creating a sample of data that's not representative of the whole population. In other words, maybe my data is selected non-randomly. And if my data is selected non-randomly, then I've most likely introduced selection bias. And this could be a source from manipulation, right? Maybe I'm doing this intentionally because I'm trying to promote my own agenda. But selection bias can also result from simply not being careful. So I want to be clear. I'm not saying that everyone would manipulate their data to promote their agenda. Sometimes we might introduce selection bias because we're not being careful in how we design our investigation. So here's an example. I survey people to find out their attitudes about the current president of Ecuador. Well, I want this to be a good investigation that reveals how the population feels, but maybe I survey mostly people in the Conservative Party, and that is one of the Ecuadorian political parties. So that would be like surveying here in the United States, but focusing mainly on Republicans or maybe mainly on Democrats. Am I going to get a really valid picture of the views of the population? No, I'm not. So I'm probably introducing bias in my data. Another example, let's say that I report data on deforestation rates, but I kind of manipulate it by selecting years with the historically highest rates. And so I'm painting a picture that's going to drive home my point. So maybe the historically highest rates were, 5 or 6 years ago. And so I give that data. Well, when I do that, because I'm kind of distorting the picture, then I'm painting a slightly misleading picture in order to support my own point. And that also would not be good use of data, right? Let's talk about this idea of correlation versus causation, because this is something students really need to understand. You've probably heard these topics. When variables move together, whether positively, same direction, or negatively in the opposite direction, we say that there's a correlation. So when variables move together, we say that there's a correlation. But here's the thing, that correlation might be due to chance. It doesn't have to mean that one variable caused the other to change, right? So if variables move together, either positively or negatively, there's a correlation, but it might be due to chance. It doesn't necessarily mean that one variable caused the other to change. So if it's chance, if it just seems to be that things are correlated because of chance, we call this a spurious correlation. Spurious correlation. Here's an example. So I found this from somebody else who had put this together, and so I've taken his example, but notice I've cited it at the bottom. We've got divorce rates in Maine and per capita consumption of margarine in Maine. Now, do we agree that these are correlated? They move in the same direction. Gosh, in fact, they almost have the same patterns. So these are clearly correlated in that they move in the same direction. They're both downward trends and they're almost identical. But would we want to say that one has caused the other? Has divorce rates going down in Maine caused people to consume less butter? Or has the fact that consumption of butter's gone down led to fewer divorces in Maine? Of course not, right? This is a spurious correlation. It's a correlation through chance, and certainly not a suggestion that there's a cause and effect, that there's a causal relationship between the two. When one variable is thought to have caused movement in the other, we call this causation. So cause and effect. The idea of cause and effect is what we mean by causation. So if we have causation, the variables would be correlated, but not simply due to chance. So let's say we have variables that move together, but it's not simply by chance. We really feel one has caused the other. So we could have different situations here. We could say that variable A increases and it makes variable B increase. So A goes up, B goes up. Or second case, variable A decreases and it makes B decrease. Or third case, variable A increases but it makes variable B decrease. Or variable A decreases and it makes variable B increase, right? There are 4 different kinds of correlation and causation that we could have here. So we want to make sure we understand the distinction between correlation, because it could be spurious, and whether or not we really have causation. So here's an example. We see increased drilling for oil in the Amazon. If we track this over time, we've seen the amount of drilling go up. We've also seen increased water pollution in the Amazon. So we want to know, is this just a correlation? Do they just happen to move together? More drilling, increased water pollution, or is it a causation? Has one caused the other? And this is a big issue of debate. Now, Selva, who's our host organization, says that this is a causation, plain and simple. We have more drilling, and this has caused more water pollution, and they've done some things to investigate it. But in the video that you're going to watch on the Texaco Chevron lawsuit, some people try to argue that, hey, this is just a correlation, a spurious correlation. And what they're saying when they say, hey, this is just a spurious correlation, they're arguing that there are these other confounding factors that make it look like cause and effect, but really there are other things going on. It's really the result of other things. And so if you were a lawyer defending Texaco Chevron, right, you would want to convince people that, hey, the increased water pollution, yeah, it exists, but it's not because of drilling. It looks like it moved in the same direction. Drilling caused water, but no, the water pollution is really a result of all kinds of other things going on and really has nothing to do with Texaco and Chevron. You get the idea. So in summary, we're going to be working in the field while we are in the Amazon, which means we're going to be generating primary data. But we're also going to have to understand Ecuador's economy in order to fully understand this situation and the debate about drilling for oil in the Amazon. And so that's going to require learning about data as well. We're going to learn about the threats to biodiversity in the Amazon. And so all of these things mean we're going to be working with data of others. And so we're generating primary data and we're going to be working with secondary data. But our use of data is going to be very important to the study of this idea of drilling for oil in the Amazon jungle. It's important that we report our data that we find without bias. And so you're going to be doing field work and reporting those results, and we want to make sure that we've used kind of a good methodology, done a good investigation, and have not accidentally manipulated our data in any way. And of course, we want to evaluate the data sources that we're going to rely on. When we look at Ecuador's economy, are we looking at valid sources? When we look at biodiversity statistics, are we looking at valid sources? There are going to be times in this class that you're going to be asked for your opinion, and of course, that means you're going to be asked to think normatively, but we caution you, normative ideas can still be justified with positive information like data. So if we ask you to defend your position, you need to motivate, justify, and data helps you do that. When we make connections, we need to think about both correlation and causation. There are a lot of people that confuse those two things. Just because things are correlated doesn't mean there's a causal connection. And while correlation is easy to prove, right? You can just plug data in and calculate a correlation. You can do that right in Excel. It's just a simple statistical calculation. So correlation is easy to prove, but causation, now that's much more difficult to establish. And so making causal claims, we're going to have to be quite careful about that. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions at all, please send me an email. Otherwise, have a nice day.